Welcome back to another episode of the Leading Saints podcast. Today I'm welcoming in Kyle Turner. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good. Now you teach pharmacy at the University of Utah.
I do.
To the medical students?
Yeah.
Or are they going to become pharmacists themselves?
Yep, going to become pharmacists.
Nice.
Yep.
And you're in a bishopric?
I am.
But you also deal with a lot of healthcare leadership development. Like how'd you get into that?
Yeah. So about 10 years ago, while I was a student, I actually had a faculty member basically ask me, like, do you want a free trip to Boston? I'm like, okay, right. I was a pharmacy student. That sounded good. But I ended up going to a leadership summit, and it was really amazing. It was actually based in storytelling, so in narrative, and how that's a leadership skill. And that was sort of the kind of ignited this idea that, we need to be good leaders. We need leadership development, and healthcare is like full of opportunities to lead. There's lots of broken things in healthcare. And so that planted the seed. As a resident in Minnesota, I had a program based in leadership that I loved, and I've just sort of stuck with it. And I love it more than pharmacy, right? I don't actually do a lot of pharmacy. I spend a lot of my time in how do teams work together? How do we develop leaders, self-awareness?
That's cool. So was this conference you went to in Boston, was it for healthcare professionals?
Yeah, it was me and then as a pharmacy student in a whole room of medical students.
Nice.
I was like, what am I doing here? And they kept asking the same thing, like, why are you here?
Yeah.
But that just the idea that, how do you lead change, and how do we use our stories to help us to do that?
So we're going to talk about, as far as relational leadership, is sort of the concept that is it the portion, like where did this concept come from?
That conference actually was led by a group called Intent Health Strategies. So that's it's a nonprofit. We spend a lot of our time doing trainings either with individuals or teams. And so how do you help a team function better? So they put that conference on, and I was sort of like the leech. I never left, right? I just I worked with him as a student, as a resident, and now in my regular job, I actually get to bring that into my day job, which is really fun.
So relational leadership is also tied into this concept of a narrative, telling stories and focusing on a narrative in leadership. Like maybe where's a good launching off?
Yeah. Let me draw the connection. So relational leadership is all about harnessing our connections as people to then go and do whatever change work needs to be done. But it's really the idea, I kind of phrase it as a focus on the who and the why as much as the what and the how. And I feel like in leadership development, there's a lot about the what and the how.
Yeah.
But you start a foundation of who am I? Who are you? Where do we connect? And then narrative is one of the things that we teach as part of that framework.
Yeah. So I see this a lot, like just in my work with Leading Saints, where people want, when they listen to a podcast episode or hear a presentation, they want no, how did you do that? Like you said what, and then you did what? Then they want the 5-step plan, right? Yeah. Which is interesting and helpful to talk about, but we sort of jump into that too quickly.
Right? Yeah. I mean, think about most meetings we go to, right? We just jump right into the agenda.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time in, let's slow down, check in. How are you? Where do we line up? What are our shared values? And then we'll get to the stuff. But we'll go so much further and faster if we've developed trust in a relationship there.
And this is a really difficult thing to do. I mean, it's easier said than done, right? And
absolutely.
And you see this, like, just to use some more church examples of, it's easy for that leader, like an elders quorum president, be like, we want to create a ministering culture here, right? And obviously we need to do our ministering. Everybody's assigned. And we sort of jump into like, now go do this thing. When in reality, that leader hasn't taken the time to just connect that community, that little elders quorum community, and be like, let's share each other's stories. Like, where do you come from? Right. Like that's a crucial foundation in any leadership effort that you undertake.
Yeah, absolutely. And we blow by it so fast.
Yeah.
Right. We don't take the time to do that. And so, it absolutely 100% focus on who am I as a leader, but then listen to all the other stories. And that's where we actually begin to see people. Like, I actually know you now in a different way than I did before.
Yeah. So where's the next step in this relational leadership, or like, how do we begin to do this thing that's sometimes difficult?
Yeah. So we talk a lot about, we have to raise our level of awareness so that we act with more intentionality. So that's not rocket science, but as we become more self-aware, as we become more aware of people around us, then we can decide, is my knee-jerk reaction the right thing, or do I need to slow down and really think? So I think a lot of it is just about, where are we being intentional to create the spaces we need to do this type of work, right? Do we need to get to the elders quorum lesson, or do we need to stop and take 20, 30, maybe the whole hour and do this work? We need to make the container instead of just moving through the motions.
Yeah.
Like we normally
So
do.
how do you increase awareness? I mean, and it seems like it's like on paper it makes so much sense, right? But sometimes in practice it's nuanced. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first it's self-awareness, right? It's me. Like, what do I care about? What am I good at? I mean, so many episodes and different tools out there, right? Maybe you want to do Strengths Finder. Maybe you want to do, we use one called 5 Dynamics. But it's, how do I normally operate? And once I know that, then I can start to think, well, how do you operate, right? How does Kurt operate different than Kyle? And how do we blend that together? And story is one way to do that, but there's lots of other ways.
Yeah, because there are these more technical assessments, right?
Yeah, sure.
And I love Strength Finders, and there's several others that, and I'm just thinking in a church context. I mean, maybe you don't, force everybody to take Strength Finders and you put the results on the walls, but nonetheless, if you have some type of measuring stick that way, again, just sort of see what comes to the surface, whether it's super scientific or not.
Yeah.
So it's a starting point, right?
Yeah, and it might be different. Like in a presidency, I might advocate that maybe we do use a tool, right? Maybe we do actually take the time because we're going to work closely together for a very long time. But in a bigger context, it can be more simple.
Yeah.
Right.
And imagine just having, again, not jumping into the agenda too quickly, but having more of a conversational, like, how do you handle things? Like, how do you prefer this meeting go? Or what's a bad meeting look like to you? What's a positive one look like to you?
Yeah. One thing that we talk a lot about is we don't tend to understand each other's work styles, right? Everybody approaches work and collaboration in a different way. And people get really frustrated by that, but that's because we haven't had the conversations to start to be like, well, what do you like to do? Like, which aspects do you like to do? Do you like the budget or do you not? Or like, I get the budget. That's my thing. I'm like, I can do the budget. Do you like to go out and talk to people? Does that energize you?
Yeah.
Or does it deplete you? And so even just those simple conversations of like, how do you approach your work, but do it in an intentional way? Then you start to understand, oh, I know how so-and-so operates. And you can start to figure out how to work better together.
Yeah. And then you have that organizational culture that sort of lays on top of everything. So, you think of, brand new bishop and a bishopric. It's like, okay, we're supposed to have ward council, and you naturally go into a room. Maybe it's the bishop's office. Maybe it's another one. You sit in a circle. Yeah. Maybe you just go around the room and see, so there's we just assume there's a way to do it, when in reality, for me, that's not a great meeting for me to be in. But a more casual, like if I'm out visiting people and we're having casual conversations, that actually helps me process things in a little bit differently, right? So again, assuming nothing, and trying to recognize what those cultural norms are just on how we do things.
Yeah. And taking the time to check in, right? So you're in a ward council. What if you get a new young women's president? Do you do any sort of like onboarding?
Initiation,
this is what we do. Let's, or do you just like, put the cog in the wheel and keep it spinning, So I think that's the leadership part, is let's say, hey, let's slow down. Let's make sure we're all good. Yeah. Right. We're all on the same page. We understand each other. We see each other. Yeah. And then ward council is going to go better. Yeah. Right. We're going to understand.
So just finding some way to process as far as the awareness. How can we get more self-aware? And there's always something to learn, right? And so you can't maybe spend too much time with awareness, but anything else you would add? Just
no, I mean, you could nerd out forever, right? And I think it's me. I'll take every assessment you throw at me. Your average person probably doesn't want to do that, but just taking some time to reflect and who am I? What do I value? What am I good at? Where are my weaknesses? Just be really in touch with that, and then bring that into the leadership spaces, whether it's church or work or whatever it happens to be.
Any other examples come to mind, maybe whether in the healthcare world or in the church world?
Well, I mean, we talk about this a lot. Healthcare is delivered by teams. You might have a physician, a nurse practitioner, a PA, a nurse, social worker, a care manager. And we like to like throw everybody into a room and pretend like we're operating as a team. And it doesn't work like that, right? Like that intentionality. But, am I aware of that? Am I aware of, so-and-so likes to work this way? Like I learned early on when I was working with doctors, I had to figure out like, what's their style? Because I'd come with a recommendation or an idea or maybe a correction of some sort. And I had to figure out like, how do I place that? How do I frame it in their style and their language so that it'll go well? And we might do that at church too, right? How do I talk to my bishop? How do I talk to my Relief Society president? How do I work on making things better, but do it in a way that's going to resonate with that person?
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the individual, because there's many doctors who are bishops. The person who's like listening to this, like they feel like if I'm not, I would love to create more awareness in the team I'm working with, in the ward council or the presidency, but I'm not necessarily one in charge.
Yeah.
And the bishop sort of has his agenda, or the Relief Society president is headed this way, and she's headed down that track full bore, and there's no stopping her, right? And so, any thoughts on how we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've spent most of my time in little L leadership, right? Where you're not the one in charge. And so it is a little trickier. You have to be a little more subtle, but I often think it's, hey, I just learned this thing. Can I share it with you? And then maybe we could do it. Like, I feel like this is my role right now in my calling, is I have an idea, but I'm not in charge. But, is there a space to share that idea? And maybe it's not in the middle of ward council. Maybe it's a quick hallway chat, like, hey, maybe the ward council would benefit from this. Or, it's a little more subtle, but I feel like most people appreciate ideas when they're presented in a way that it's not threatening. It's not telling someone how to do their job. It's just, hey, I wonder about this.
Yeah.
Right. And I would do that all the time in a clinical setting. Hey, I wonder if we might try a drug like this, if the patient it would go better for the patient. And that's a lot better than like, hey, you're really screwing this up, and you should really change how you're approaching this. So I think we have to be a little courageous in those little L leader moments, but I think we can do that, and we can find a way to be thoughtful and tactful and appeal to that person.
Yeah, I think it just takes, just the tough conversations at times. Like, if you have a leader that doesn't seem, who quickly dismisses your feedback, sometimes like, we need to have a kind of conversation. I feel like whenever I give feedback, it's dismissed. Do you want feedback from me? Yeah. You just want me to go along to get along? Like, because that may not work for me.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think finding ways to have tough conversations, brave conversations. I think the other approach is go find your early adopters. Right? Who else are you noticing might be on board? And it's not that you're ganging up, right? But you're building that little coalition to say, hey, we want to do something a little different. And that's a lot harder to say no to than, one person just throwing out an idea.
Yeah. All right. So awareness, where do we go next with relational leadership concept?
Yeah. I mean, I think the genesis of my thoughts here was, I think maybe you were doing the podcast on men in the church.
Men in elders quorum.
And elders quorum, and we were talking about stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sitting there, I was out on a walk, and I was listening, and I thought, well, we do a lot of work around stories, but how do you operationalize it? So my wife gives me grief all the time. She's like, you can't go around telling people that you're like the story, like they're not going to get it. But it's there's kind of simple ways to share your story. There's some frameworks you can use. And I was just thinking about the poor elders quorum president listening to the podcast thinking, he wants me to tell stories. Yeah. It sounds like a good idea to build culture and connection and community. But like, how do I do that?
Or they're thinking, I think we just got to get to the general conference talk, right?
Yeah,
like that's why we're here. Like, that's what the men are expecting. And you want me to have them tell stories? Like, that kind of seems weird.
Cognitive disconnect there, right? Like, I'm not sure what they're talking about. So my thought was to maybe share a framework we use in relational leadership.
Love it.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So credit where credit's due. This actually has its root in community organizing, which isn't, I think, an avenue or arena that we spend much time in.
Because that's more like a political community.
Yeah, right. Your traditional, picket line, make change. But it actually has its genesis with someone named Marshall Gantz. He's a Harvard professor. And our work is with someone named Matt Lewis. He actually has a PhD in storytelling. I give him a hard time.
That's a thing?
Yeah, I know.
I'm going back to school.
I think it's, what does he call it? It's cultural ethnography.
Okay.
but we like to say it's a PhD in storytelling. But we have a framework called narrative leadership. And it's 3 parts: story of self, who am I? Why am I called as a leader? A story of us, what are our shared values? What makes us a group? And then the story of now is, what's the action? What's the change? But we spend a lot of time in story of self, which is, why am I called as a leader? What do I care about? How do I show up? And it has a really easy framework to it. It's challenge, choice, outcome. So what's a challenge I faced, a choice I made, and then an outcome?
Love it.
Which is kind of the narrative arc of most stories.
Yeah.
So if you think about like most movies or good books, right? It's protagonist faces some daunting challenge, makes a difficult choice, and then, lives happily ever after.
Yeah.
But it's how do we bring that into us, right? Our own story of self.
Yeah. And that's because I think a lot of leaders may hear like, oh, you should share your story. And most people are like, well, I don't really have a story. And I'm just, listen, like, the stake president just asked me to do this thing, this calling. So I'm doing it. Like, I'm not,
Yeah.
like, there's nothing
Yep.
dramatic behind it. Right. But to then frame it like, well, what challenges have you faced in life and what choices that lead to? And then where are you at now? Or where did that lead you?
Well, if you think about it, we read ourselves into stories that way.
Oh yeah.
Right.
We're the protagonists.
Yeah,
right?
like when Luke Skywalker is having a problem, right? Like we are now in that. Or
we all face Darth Vaders in life.
Exactly.
And sometimes they're our dad.
Yeah. And the scriptures are full of it too, right? I was thinking a little bit about this, like Nephi, go get the plates. Oh, Laban won't give you the plates? Like that's a problem.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go back, I'm gonna try again, and then the outcome. And we just see it over and over again in the scriptures. And so it just provides, I like to think it's a pretty simple way for us to just try it out, and okay, what's a challenge I faced in my life? What choice did I make because of it? And then what happened?
Yeah.
And it works pretty well.
So don't let me take you too far in your outline here, but so what does this look like in practice? Like you're gathering maybe an elders quorum together and saying, everybody think of a challenge and share it with your neighbor, or like,
yeah, I
anything...
think this is kind of awkward if you just try and like leap into it. So you do have to lay the groundwork just a little bit. And I don't think you always have to like lay out the framework. And it's very countercultural. Like you said, everyone's going to show up and they're going to be like, so what's the lesson? And you're like, we've actually thrown the lesson out today and we're going to tell stories. Like that is not going to, that's going to feel funny.
And this
right?
is a tough thing. And it's not just with this concept, but just in general, we've trained our culture that when you go to church, like when I walk into a Sunday school class, I'm sort of trained to be in a beta state where I'm just like, I'm going to passively listen. Maybe I'll share a comment.
Yeah.
But my default state is beta.
It's like receive.
Rather than being like an alpha, like, oh, hey, I'm going to be involved here. And so whether it's a leader, a teacher, they have to coax them out of that state, that passive state, and say, no, this is a different experience. And it's everybody's going to be safe, walk with me here as we do this. Right.
Yeah. And I often will just give people the warning, something different is about to happen. Like I think about national conferences and most people like pull out their laptop and they're kind of passively listening. I usually start my talks of like, just so you know, you're not going to be able to do that today. Like today it's going to be active. We're going to ask you to do something. You're going to be a little uncomfortable. Right? We're going to try and stretch you just a little bit. And that at least puts everyone's, like their signals go up. They start paying attention. And so I think when you're thinking about culture change, and I was pondering on this as I was listening, you do have to stick with it. You have to just plan that it's going to be awkward. You'll probably fumble once or twice, and it's going to require just a little bit of persistence to make sure it happens. Yeah.
Awesome. Where do we go next?
Well, we could talk specifically around a little more around the framework, or
yeah. So let me ask with these narratives, or that as you're teasing out everybody's story. Is this something that should be like 30-minute activity? Obviously, there's different ways to do it, maybe, but
maybe some basic principles,
okay.
Right? When we do this, it's generally a 2 to 3 minute story. And we do that because 1, people aren't going to pay attention for very long. 2, it encourages you to actually like get to the point. And usually these stories are like a snapshot, like it's a moment in time. It's not, oh, then I did this, and 2 years later I did this, and we're not given the history. We're trying to pull people into a moment that was important for us. And I like to kind of right size it. It's not, Matt will always say it's not big C challenge always. It doesn't have to be like your deepest, darkest, biggest challenge you've ever faced, because the setting might not be right for that. There might not be enough safety in an elders quorum or a Leaf Society to have everybody just like dive into their deepest moments. But what's a little C? What was like a little thing that was hard, and go there. And so as people are thinking, what can I share? It can be really simple. It can be something that was a little tricky, but you made your way through it.
Yeah. And there's so many opportunities, maybe frame it a certain way of like, take a lot of the people back to their mission, or as it being a youth in the church. Like when was that moment? And because you're wanting a moment, you're not wanting, life was tough in the first 6 months of my mission. Like, no, what was the moment that was tough?
Yeah.
Where were you? What was the setup?
Yeah. And the big part is, story is a way that we share our values without telling people what we value. Because you might sit down and say, I value hard work and, family and yada, yada, yada. And people are like, okay.
Yeah. Who
great,
doesn't?
whatever.
Right?
Yeah, right? But when you tell a story and you say, let me tell you about the time that I struggled as a dad and what I did and what happened, all of a sudden, all those values come out, but they do it in just a more powerful way. And what ends up happening is we end up connecting on those shared values. So as we're sitting, listening to somebody else tell their story, we're again writing ourselves into their story, but it's someone we know. And now all of a sudden we're developing a connection, and that starts to build that community of people together. And that's the powerful moment when we connect on shared values.
So this may be just a few minutes where you're each sharing some stories, a story in your life. How do we transition this from story of self to story of us? So it becomes like, not only am I benefited from hearing your story and sharing my story, but we're like more united. And maybe that just happens organically.
I mean, I think that's hopefully one of the outcomes, right? Is after a while, someone might be like, hey, I listened to so-and-so share their story, and that made a difference for me. And I felt like I connected. And it's sort of like a web of, you just start to connect everyone. And then you have that shared story. Now you've got a quorum or a class or a presidency that is aligned together because they understand where everybody's coming from.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people are going to be like, do I have to like tell them about this challenge, choice, outcome thing? Like, that feels kind of intimidating. I think me as a teacher, I go to the default, like, let me give you the framework and teach you the didactic. But as an elders quorum president, that's going to be hard. So I did come up with a few questions that I think get at challenge, choice, outcome, but they're a little more subtle.
Okay.
So for example, on our team professionally, when we would get a new member of our pharmacy team, we would take some time and I would just give people the prompt, tell me about a childhood experience you had that helped you become the person you are today. And there's a little bit of intention there. It's childhood experience is immediately going to go a little vulnerable, something we don't normally talk about, but the helped make you who you are today gives it sort of a hopeful spin. Because what we don't want to do is sit there and kind of like, it's not therapy, right? We're not all, just unloading on each other. So that was one. Another one was around, how did you receive your testimony of the gospel? I think in there you're going to find challenge, choice, outcome, right? Like, oh, I wasn't sure about something, and then I wrestled with it and prayed about it, and here's what happened. Or, what was a challenge or trial you've experienced that strengthened your faith? Again, the challenge is going to be a little vulnerable, but the strength in your faith gives it a hopeful ending. So I think you could come up with any number of questions. If you're in a YSA ward, if you're in a family ward, if you're, depending on the setting, you might craft a question. But how do you get someone to open that vulnerability door just a little bit and provide kind of that positive, hopeful outcome?
Right.
It doesn't always have to be that way, but I just find if you get too much negative outcome, that you're going to kind of lose the purpose.
Gotcha.
It's kind of like going to a movie with a bad ending.
Yeah.
Right. We don't tend to, those aren't, the popular ones.
So the way you're setting it up is you're making sure that there's hope in the story, right? That like, how did that help you in life, right? Or whatever.
Yeah. Help you become where you're at, strengthen your faith. whatever it happens to be.
Gotcha. Anything else as far as that story of us? I'm just thinking, I see just organically, the more iterations you do of this, the more it's going to unify that group, and suddenly this identity of that group is much more clear, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is, there is some tactic around this, right? And you could try and get up and share a story of us, right? You could try and note the shared values that you found. And maybe a leader does it. It's a little bit storytelling 2.0. The self is the easy part.
Yeah.
The us is I have to make some assumptions, or I need to draw on the experiences we've had together. So you could have a story of us, which was, remember the time that we all showed up after so-and-so's basement flooded. And we all sat there and we slung mud and we threw stuff in the dumpster, and like that was a little bit of an us moment. And, you could share that. But I do think the feeling of us is what starts to come after we build those connections. And
I'm just thinking, like, if there's in that transition of the story of us, if it feels a little empty, maybe there hasn't been a lot of those stories of, we've actually never gathered together, or we've never done that service thing, but now that we know each other, maybe we can go do something. And the next time we reunite, we'll have a deeper, more dynamic story of us because we did go do that service assignment, or we did went, on that shooting activity or whatever it is that those, the story of us become, you can write that story in real time.
And I mean, you could think about doing this a couple different ways. Like, you could take your whole Relief Society hour and you could break people into groups of 4 or 5 and give everybody that 2 or 3 minutes to share a story. And I can almost guarantee that what happens in that small group is going to be pretty powerful. A little mini story of us is going to develop. Or maybe you do that once, and then if people weren't around, maybe somebody takes 5 minutes at the beginning of a lesson and they get their chance to share their story.
Yeah.
But you stick with that long enough, you do that a few times, that's when you're going to start to feel, right, the glue. Because every time we do a session on story and people are able to share together, there's a little bit of secret sauce that happens in there.
Right.
And it's totally organic, right? You're not forcing it. It's whatever the group is bringing into the room. But, safety goes up a little bit, trust goes up a little bit. And now you've got 4 or 5 people who feel connected to each other.
Yeah.
Maybe it's even a training session, training your ministers, right? Like, think about story. How do you weave story into your ministering visit? How do you share who you are? How do you kind of tease out that other person? And it's in a genuine and caring way.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of little applications. It doesn't have to just be like a workshop, but how do I weave these principles in and start to build that trust with other people?
And I'm just thinking, again, as you do this more and more, by the 6th time you do this, suddenly when you do get to the conference talk and the lesson, it's a different experience, right? The comments are different.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And because I think most elders quorums, I mean, I don't hear a lot of people rave about like, I just love my elders quorum lesson, right? And bless their hearts, I know people are trying. I don't want to diminish the efforts that are there. But sometimes you're just like, I just don't know why this isn't clicking. Like, yeah, we got some comments happening. It's the same 5 people that comment. We do our thing. We go home. I guess we'll do it again next time. But again, you're sort of fostering this fire. And suddenly it's like, wow, like those 3 comments, that was like a moment for this quorum,
And I think what you're getting at is this does happen every once in a while, right? Somebody will actually raise their hand and say, let me tell you about, this challenging thing going on. And it's usually based on the lesson, and it does change the mood, right? The whole feeling in the room changes. What if we did that on purpose, right? What if we started with that instead of hoping that maybe it happens for 5 minutes at some point during the lesson?
Yeah. And, obviously there's this general resistance to the term, all right, everybody turn to your neighbor, or let's get in groups. Like people are like, come on, like I don't want to do that. It's something in our nature as humans. We hate to get in groups. And again, we want to be in a passive state. Just give us the lesson. And but it sounds like, I mean, this is a crucial part is you're not, I can just see maybe an elders quorum president or Relief Society president stand up with the group and be like, who wants to tell a story, right? Maybe that happens every once in a while, but this is a small group activity, right?
Yeah, I'd say,
or a pair of
you stand up and say, we're gonna do something different today. and we're going to get together. And the goal here is for us to really get to know each other on a deeper level.
Yeah.
Now you've set the stage. They're going to have to come out of beta, and that's okay, right? They've now been alerted to that. I also think we're just so used to kind of doing stuff in the head, right? The logic, I should do this. This is my duty. This is what the handbook says.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't spend enough time engaging the heart, right? Like, and stories are the way that we engage the heart, right? We get a little emotion. If I, harness my Matt Lewis here, who would give me the evidence behind this, there's actually, so there was a study done. I'm going to get nerdy for a second.
Love it. That's what we do here,
right?
Kyle.
You got the nerdy professor going on here. That they studied people with damaged amygdalas. And the amygdala
a part of the brain.
is part of the brain. Yep, anatomy here, right? It's the emotional processing center of the brain.
Okay.
And so what they were trying to see is like, what was the deficit? And what was fascinating is they could still reason, right? 1 + 1 still equal 2. A cow was a cow. But they couldn't make decisions. They were sort of in this kind of paralyzed state. So we often say, like, don't make emotional decisions. But it turns out that actually all we're doing is making emotional decisions.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you get to, and if you think about the last piece of that is the story of now, which is the call to action, right? Think about how often we lead with the call to action, which is like, you should go out and do your ministry. You should show up for this activity. You should, right? We've skipped all the parts before. We haven't actually engaged the heart, that emotion, that decision-making center. Once you get some of that going, then all of a sudden when somebody needs help, it's not like, oh, so-and-so down the street. It's the person I sat with and heard about their challenge and their life. And it's a whole different story.
Okay, so you're going to love this. So I found there's this guy that does this YouTube channel. It's very well done. It's sort of the leading saints of the evangelical world. And he'll give like tips and tricks online, right? Like, and he had this video. I shared it in the Leading Saints community, which everybody should be a part of and join and continue the conversation going. So I posted in there, but he did this video about how to give announcements in church. I mean, something so basic. You think, what do I just give the announcement, right?
Yeah.
And he said, you will have a much higher rate of people internalizing it and remembering it if you embed the announcement in a story. Yeah. So he'll say something like, I remember last chili cook-off, Brother Jones, you had that hot chili, right? And I remembered I had to bring some extra water to, you're telling the story about what happened at the last chili cook-off. And just so you know, we're having that this Saturday. It's at this time, right? And so I thought, what a genius way to do announcements is figure out how to embed the announcement in a story, because our brains turn on. It activates that emotional part of our brain. So we lean in rather than chili cook-off Saturday 6. Thank you. Moving on.
And, second nerdy data point there is they've done imaging studies. And as people hear stories, the brain lights up.
Oh, yeah.
What's fascinating is the story ends and the brain stays lit. Right. So it's a little bit of the science behind that. People are going to hold on to what they felt, and you might get that announcement to be more effective. Right. Cool. You might get that call to come and help or do this or do that.
Yeah.
Be more effective that way.
Another thing, and of course I'm a genius leader. What can I say? No, I'm giving my own example of a good tactic. But when I was a high priest group leader long ago, one thing I did, it was home teaching back then, but I brought in a handful of sisters from the Relief Society who I knew had had very positive experiences with home teaching or ministering. And I just had them tell their story about what that meant to them. And I was trying to humanize what we're trying to do, right? And for them to hear that, that's going to activate something different rather than a good, solid guilt trip. And, you better get on board because the prophet asked us to.
Yeah,
right?
And that's all in the head, right?
Yes.
And the stories, right? And seeing what impact it can have. Yeah. That's all in the heart.
And, talking about this head and heart dynamic, I think we fall in this trap a little bit. There's such an emphasis on teaching doctrine, which I totally get. I'm fully behind. Doctrine's powerful. But if we do it in a way where we're just sort of talking about facts, right? Like, or doctrine as if they're facts. Well, we obviously know that this scripture says this and that, and here's a quote by Elder Gong, and he said this. But we have to help them internalize the doctrine through story. Like, what does this actually mean for you? When did this story or when did this doctrine actually show up in your life?
Yeah, the application of the doctrine through story.
They're really important.
Actually, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but I went to a public speaking course, and they talked about when you're prepping, right? Get your one big idea. Like if there's one thing I'm going to get across, like this is it. What's the story that goes along with it? And then what's the like how to associated with it?
Yes.
If you think about, man, if we framed our lessons, if we framed our church talks that way, I just want to get this one point across. This is what it meant to me through this story. And here's what you can do with it. It would be much more powerful lessons and talks.
Yeah, the narrative is so powerful in those talks, you know.
Yeah, and we can do this. Like we're more natural at this than we give ourselves credit for.
It's true.
But a little bit of framing, a little bit of technique, right? People like, you know, don't skip the details. One thing we always talk about is engage the senses. Like what was going on? What did you see? What did you smell? What did you feel as we're trying to like transport people into that moment? So this is a little bit of craft, right? But the more we practice it and we're a little intentional about trying these techniques, then our stories start to get better and better over time. Yeah.
I'll just reference this so it's in the show notes and people can, if they want to dive deeper, I did an interview with Matthew Dix, not a Latter-day Saint, but a professional storyteller. And his tactics, I still use them just so, again, like creating we don't just tell a story like, oh, this one time I'm on my mission and we talked to this person, but it's like when you start saying, I was on my mission in Puerto Rico and it was a really hot time of the year and it was raining. And suddenly we're hypnotized.
Yeah. We're in that moment.
We're bringing them into it.
Yeah.
And it's a different experience than just getting to the point of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So anything else that needs to touch on as far as so he's talked about the story of self, the story of us, and then the story of now, like help us understand that.
The last piece, if you think about this as I've shared my story. Who am I? Story of self. I hope that that's resonated with the group when we share those values that they've heard. The story of now is really, it's a call to action. And you frame the nightmare if we don't act and the hope if we do. And that sounds really dramatic. And if you think about...
And almost manipulative if you use it wrong.
Yeah, 100%. We can get there. Yeah, we can talk about that too in a second. All tools can be used to manipulate. But, if you think about the world of community organizing, those calls to action were a big deal. There was a nightmare going on. But nobody's going to follow a nightmare, right? We only follow leaders who have a hopeful, optimistic vision of the future. So, and again, in church context, this might be a little more subtle, but if we don't do something, what's going to happen, right? If we don't get the youth to the event, if we don't keep coming back to ministering, right? If we don't do our ministering, so you kind of drop that, but then you give the contrast of, but if we do something, if we decide to show up, if we decide to, operate differently, here's what's going to happen. Here's the positive outcome that's on the end of that. So, don't try self us now all at once, right? That's 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. I'd say play around in the self sandbox, right? Working on getting people just telling their stories of self. Give that some time, let that marinate, and then you can talk about us. And then if you really want to get into it, that story of now. Yeah.
And I think just giving permission, I'm sort of witnessing this, and this is a tough situation, and it causes me to ponder because I just constantly am thinking leadership. That's why I'm this guy. So, but I'm in a ward it's a newer ward. It's in a very developing area, so lots of new people moving in. And I just sit in elders quorum, and part of me feels like this is a really, like, we want to get to the lesson, but I see the elders quorum presidency struggling sometimes with how do we just get this group going, and so I appreciate that just to give yourself permission to sort of slowly warm up the group, right? That because there's such this pressure of like, all right, I'm going to get to, here's a few announcements. Brother John, you got the lesson, right? Let's go. But just to be like, we're actually going to tell stories for a few minutes, and we're going to do it a lot. And part of me, I think some leaders be like, but then we're doing it wrong, right? But it's like, no, like you're doing it right because you're warming them up to a place where you can do it really right. Yeah.
And it makes me think like someone new moves in, give them 5 minutes. Yeah. Ask them to come in and like really tell us who you are. Don't give us the quick like
anybody
I'm so and I've got this many kids. That's what I do. And then you sit down. It's like no. Tell us tell us who you are and
Yeah, like what's the story?
Yeah, what you're
not
working
just
on,
like what are the facts, right?
Yeah, what matters to you?
Yeah,
and
that's
you know,
powerful.
that would be one way in that kind of ward
Mhm.
to bring that in.
And I'm another proponent. This is actually, I'm starting this up in my current ward. I've done it in other wards, is a ward podcast where I meet with people just in this type of setting, and I just interview them. Like, so tell me about your faith development. Like, where'd you go on your mission? What was the experience like when you got your mission call to Sacramento, California? Were you disappointed? Because I was sort of disappointed when I got called to Sacramento, California. So, and then sort of you have this library of stories that then when people see like, okay, hey, I listened to your story this week, and you're like, oh, he kind of knows me.
The hallway chatter would be way different.
Yeah, and so I think the goal, like the story of now, is more like this goal. It's not like this thing you do as much as like a state of the community of like, we are now in a story together because we know each other, we see each other, like we're a community. We're not just here because they drew the great geographic lines around our neighborhood and told us what time church was at, which unfortunately where a lot of people are.
And then the calls to action will actually get heated. So what if you were a new leader called and you said, you know what, I'm not going to push an agenda, right? I'm going to build a community. I'm going to just start with community. I'm going to start with making sure we understand each other. And what's funny is you don't even have to be a new leader to do this. We have people that we do these workshops with that have worked together for a decade. And we'll do story sessions and they'll be like, I learned more about that person in the 2 to 3 minute story that they shared than I ever learned in the decade working together. Because we move past the surface and we start to dive in to real stuff. And then you think about you keep doing that, you keep getting people talking about real stuff, then, you know, when people are checking in the hall, it's a better interaction. Yeah. When they're, you know, asking to come and visit people in their home as part of a ministering visit, the likelihood of acceptance of that is going to go up because we've already had good, deep, meaningful, right, conversations. Yeah. So I don't want people to think of this as a tactic. If it's a tactic, it's going to fail. It's got to come from a genuine place of like, I do care. I do want to hear. I do want to kind of build that sense of community. Because if you try it and it's not authentic, it's going to come across. It probably does damage. Yeah. Right. Versus building.
Because it's a foundation that we're building here. It's not like we're going to do stories every time we're in Elders Quorum forever, but you have to build that foundation and then you can do the ministering. Then you can come together and do something special in that. I'm just thinking out loud here is that I think that's the default position that most wards are in is that we are built on a foundation of behaviors, right? Which behaviors are good. I love commandments, but when that's your foundation, there's just no connection there. And then leaders sometimes drive themselves crazy. We're like, man, I told them, you know, I get the emails. I keep telling this ministering, how hard is it to minister? Just call the people, go sit in their home every once in a while or talk to them in the hall or text them. Like, how hard is this? Because you have a foundation of behaviors and that it will not propel an organization forward like that connection that stories really do.
I think there's an overlap here. I spent a lot of time in the Arbinger content. Oh, love Arbinger. Right? Yes. Seeing people as people versus people as objects. Stories have a way of like immediately helping us see people as people. Right? They're not a ministering assignment. They're not another member of my ward, right? That sort of object. That's a person. Right? And you know, in their model, right, you have results which are driven by behaviors, which are driven by mindsets. If we get that mindset right, like these are people that matter, then all that behavior stuff gets better. Yeah. Right. And then the results that we're looking for start to happen. So it's one way I found that we can humanize each other pretty quickly by telling a story.
Love it. Love it. Anything we're missing in the story of self, us, now, the challenge, the choice, the outcome? Covered it pretty well.
No, I just hope we've made it doable. Yeah. Right. I hope as people are listening, it's like there's a way to get this in there, and it doesn't have to be so daunting. Hopefully we've brought down the activation energy needed to try and play with this. And we always tell people it's like riding a bike. Right. Maybe don't start it in Elders Quorum. Start it in your presidency meeting. Right. Maybe you don't have to make the first performance in front of the whole band, right? The whole audience. You know, find ways to try it yourself. Find ways to do it in a smaller setting. And then when you're like, oh, okay, like I got my story, or I've spent some time thinking about this, then
Yeah.
try it on the big stage.
Yeah. And I'm just saying, I mean, we're talking a lot in the context of, the church meeting or the elders quorum, Relief Society experience every other week, the second hour. But, even inviting a handful of men over to your house, I do this a lot, right?
Yeah.
And you're just casually talking. It's so much easier. It's almost a safer venue to be like, so tell me, like, why are you a lawyer?
Yeah.
And what's that journey like? And what choices did you make, right? Like what challenges you face, right? And I think in that more casual setting, and you can even stimulate that as an elders quorum, right? There's so many ways to do this, right?
And if you want to just flip it, I've been telling you the broadcast mode, but you flip it and you get into receiver mode, which is how do I get stories out of other people? And honestly, if you just sit there and you ask people why, not in like an interview way or like, oh, you're a lawyer, like, why did you decide to do that? Like, oh, you went to school at, Penn State. Like, how in the world did you make that choice, right? It's active listening, but it's really just asking people why, and you'll be amazed. You'll get challenge, choice, outcome, story of self brought back to you. So as a leader, that can be a really helpful skill, like little L around the campfire at your house, or big L in Relief Society or Elders Quorum.
Cool. Love it. Any other principle, concept, thing we missed? Did we do it all?
I guess my only question is, do we want to try an example?
Of course.
Or do we not?
I love some good examples.
Make this real.
This always happens to me as the host. So,
do you want to do one, or do you want me to do one?
Maybe you start.
I'm happy to do that. I came prepared for that answer.
Good.
Just in case. So maybe we'll even hit the clock and just show that, like,
it's
we can do this in 2 to 3 minutes.
And do you set a clock? Like, would you bring a clock timer thing in Elders Quorum? Or?
This would be up for debate.
Okay. Read the room a little bit.
In a professional context, we always set a timer. And we ask someone, and now it's nice because you can set your phone and it can go off, and you don't have to be the one that cuts off story. And you'll always be the bad guy, right? When you cut off, and because the conversation will be rich.
Someone just started to cry about this story.
Exactly, right? I think if you set up in the beginning that you're going to do that, that'll be fine.
Yes.
The one plus to doing it is you make sure everybody gets a chance. Like if you only have 25 minutes and you don't give people a boundary, then 2 people will go and the other 3 will miss out on the opportunity. So you do play a little bit of bad guy in order to foster an environment where everybody gets a chance to share.
Love it.
Because we know people wax long.
Yes.
Right? You give people the mic and
we can turn very verbose on people.
Yeah. So. Case in point, right? You're getting me waxing long here. So, so I'll give this a try, and I'll go into my story. I'm going to give. Actually, woke up this morning, shifting my story. I'm going to give the mission story, an experience on my mission, and then maybe we could unpack it and show people, the principles.
And this is just another. I mean, everybody's got a mission story, or 2 or 1,000. Like it's such an easy place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went on my mission to Mexico, and in my first area, my companion slept until 10 a.m. every single morning.
This is my trainer?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I get there, I'm all jazzed, like fresh out of the MTC, and he's in bed. Small side note, I actually tried to pull him out of bed once, right, by his ankles, and it didn't work super well. But I decided that he's gonna sleep. I didn't come here to sleep till 10, and I want to do stuff. But I just decided that every morning I would sit down, I'd put on my fleece jacket in kind of this chilly brick apartment, and I was just gonna read. I was gonna read everything. So I devoured the entire mission library, because you think about this, right? 3 months of 2.5 hours every morning to read.
You already get a significant amount of study time, but that is
exactly right. I read my grammar book, right? I read Jesus the Christ. But in those 2.5 hours, making that choice to just study, I read, the Book of Mormon in English and in Spanish, and Jesus the Christ, Our Search for Happiness. In those 2.5 hours, I found the Savior, right? I found, I had a testimony, but I just had these moments where I was gaining insight, and I was sort of lost for those couple hours, just strengthening my testimony. And then a couple weeks after I got a new companion, after this 3 months, I woke up one morning. I thought, it's zone conference today. Somebody would always give a talk. They could be just randomly called to give a talk in zone conference. And I thought, I'm going to get called today. Like, I know this is going to happen. And so I quickly kind of like put a little talk together, 3.5 months into my mission, and get to zone conference. And sure enough, right, we're all in there huddled. It's loud. And, Elder Turner, you're going to give our talk today. And I went up there and gave a talk. I couldn't tell you what it was about. Couldn't tell you anything about it. It seemed to go well, but everybody afterwards was like, oh, that was really great. And, like the language must be coming along, whatever. And I sat there and thought, I didn't think much of it, but in that decision to still study, and not only did I find my testimony and my relationship with the Savior, but all of a sudden reading that grammar book must have paid off, because I was able to capture the language. And I just realized, like, God honors our obedience, right? He's willing to give us blessings when we choose to be obedient to him.
Love it.
There you go.
The end. I mean,
There's the story.
Roll the credits. Or,
I have no idea how long that went. It had to be close, right?
Okay.
To 2 or 3 minutes. But one of my least favorite things to do is to debrief my own story. But maybe we can just debrief a little bit.
You recommend a debrief after each story or after everybody's
When
told?
we do it as a training, we do a debrief.
Okay.
I don't know that I would debrief like the principles of challenge, choice, outcome.
Okay. So what are you debriefing then? What's the guidance there?
We just ask people, somebody shared a story. Let's talk about, where did you hear a challenge? Where did you hear a choice? Where did you hear an outcome? And that helps whoever was giving it, like, oh, actually, I didn't get to an outcome. Thanks for, a little bit of feedback there. One question I always ask people is just, what values did you hear there? So maybe as I shared that story, what did you hear? What kind of values did you hear in my story?
Like the thing that came to mind is that that situation could have gone so negative, like just been a frustration. I got this, here I am trying to do missionary work, and, I've got a lazy companion and he's not doing it right. And, but instead you just saw that as a sacred time to be like, I'm going to double down into some really helpful content that can bless my life, and like learn more about Christ and be a better missionary and be ready to teach the gospel like you did in zone conference, right?
Any of those values resonate for you?
Yeah. I mean, I want to be more like that type of person who's not looking for reasons or, excuses why things aren't going well, but I can turn situations into a positive always. I have examples of that and examples where I kind of fell short there.
Yeah. So. And you could see how we could start actually a dialogue. Oh yeah. Right. Like, oh, I shared a story. Like, oh, let me tell you about the time that happened for me. Right. Or, so you can see where it would start to roll. The other things we talk about are, was there a moment where you were in that story with me?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
was there a visual that we're like, oh, I'm there.
I was seeing you in my missionary apartments, that wasn't Mexico, but it was easy to envision what this may look like and how it felt.
Yeah. So those are just some of the things that we unpack when someone's trying to learn this as a leader and taking it, at a workshop, trying to enhance their leadership skills, trying to help them get some coaching.
Yeah, this is really helpful because that debrief sort of takes another level, because there is benefit in just you just saying a story, I'll say a story, and wow, that's cool. I've learned something about you. You seem like a good guy, and we're good. But to then have a dialogue about the principles and the values in the story just takes it that step further. Now we're that much more connected.
Yeah. And what you might do if you were doing this in a class, you might do a debrief less about because you probably didn't present the challenge, choice, outcome or the principles behind good storytelling, but you might say, what did it feel like to tell your story in this setting? What did it feel like to hear somebody else's story? What happened? And like that kind of debrief, that gets to your story of us all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're hearing from those groups, like, this is what I heard from somebody. This is what I felt as I shared my story. That might be a valuable debrief.
Yeah. Yeah. That I often use that question, what was that like? It's so simple.
Super simple.
What did that feel like?
Yeah.
And
again, we're engaging the heart.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what'd you feel? What was it like for you? What did you experience as you were doing that?
And you're also revealing the story of us with those questions of like, what was that like telling your story in this setting? You know, were you scared? Were you comfortable? And that sort of reveals something about us and what we're moving past and hopefully making better.
Yep.
You know,
Absolutely.
So, cool.
Yep.
All right. Is it my turn? Tell a story?
Yeah, you want to do it? Let's do it. Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
I feel like I wouldn't be right for you to just tell a story.
Yeah.
So, and you got to go to the mission. I mean, that's maybe a theme you go with it. We're talking about missions and whatever. And your sleeping story triggered a story in my mind, and that's another benefit of telling stories. Is I had a companion near the end of my mission. We were companions twice actually. His name is Scott Saunders. I'm very clearly calling him out on the podcast. Love the kid. He's available, ladies. Just saying. From Virginia, and he had narcolepsy. So, he would fall asleep all the time. And we were Spanish missionaries in California, so we had a car. My whole mission, I had a car. And the mission rule, I think the handbook rule, is that companion has to stay awake when you're driving, right? And so I would typically be driving, and I would always be nudging him, and he was always just sort of on the verge of falling asleep. And he had medication, which you could tell us all about. But, and I remember there was this moment he came to me, and because he wanted so desperately to be obedient, and he wanted to be a good missionary. And he came to me, and he handed me this spray bottle, and he's like, "Elder Frankham, please, I know this is going to be difficult, but every morning you've got to spray me in the face until I wake up." Because awesome. I want to get up. I want to get with it. Because once I'm awake, I should be good. Yeah. And so we have such I just talked to him a few weeks ago, and we have just such a special relationship of coming together as companionship, of helping one another. Like, I will help you be obedient. Will you help me be obedient? And that was such an effective companionship that I cherish, because. And it was a lot of fun. And I couldn't help but laugh as I was spraying him in the face every morning with the spray bottle.
Creates a special bond.
Yes.
Right? When you spray someone in the face every morning. Yeah.
There's my story. Yeah. Is that a good story?
Fantastic.
Did I do it wrong?
No. It was great. It's great.
You can't mess this up. It's hard to mess this up.
It's hard to mess this up. I think the only way it doesn't go well is when you just start to tell like someone else's story. Like in healthcare, we do this all the time. Like, let me tell you about this patient's story. Yes. It's like, no. I heard some therapists frame it like speaking from the I, right? Yep. And this is one thing I hit with the Word podcast. Like, I don't want to come to your house and learn about how awesome your grandfather was, because that's family history. No. I want to talk about you. Yeah, exactly. So, what did you feel like you had a challenge in that? What was the challenge for you in that story?
Oh man, now you got me. Was there a challenge? I mean, just the challenge of doing like supporting a relationship that we're asked. I mean, that's why we're in companionships, right? Is to find support and to be the type of missionary we want to be. So it wasn't much of a challenge for me. So again, maybe I told someone else's story, but nonetheless, I had to. Because
you were there, right? That's absolutely your story. Yeah, okay. I heard lots of choices, right? Yes. I like the spray bottle is, or the choice to honor your companion's request, right? Like, I made that choice. Like, yes, I will help you. And then the outcome, what would you say the outcome is? I mean,
it built a connection with us that we were able to help each other out.
That lasts through today.
Yeah. And his example of striving to be, he just wanted to be a better missionary, whatever that took,
Yeah. So. Yeah. And so those values, they come out, right? Care about other people. When people ask for help, I will honor it. Longitudinal relationships, right? Like, you can hear all of that come through in that story.
Love it.
Yeah.
Well, this is fun. Did we cover it all? I mean, we gave some examples and...
I'll give one last little background to this is the idea that as humans, we are wired for connection and community. And we are always attuned to the signals that people are sending us. And so as you think about story in that context, you say hi, you smile, like those are signals. But when you choose to tell a story, when you put yourself out there, you are signaling to the other person, this is a safe space. This is a place where we can talk about real things. You do that inside a quorum, right? Those signals start to build culture. Wow. And what, so as a leader, right, I should be really conscious of the signals that I'm sending, right? Are they signals that we care, that we can be vulnerable, that we can connect with each other? Or are they signals that like, I'm just here to do the job?
Yeah.
And story is just a way to send the right kind of signals.
Yeah.
in a group of people.
I'm just thinking like in a parent context as well. My kids love to hear about the stories, my stories, of when I was a kid, when I dealt with similar things, or, we didn't have a streaming service, or my Nintendo had a cord and I couldn't just walk around the house with it.
Absolutely. So. And what that does, the signals make the relationships that much stronger.
That's cool.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to like deep dive in some of these principles, I mean, are there certain books or resources you would recommend or send them to?
I mean, you can find Marshall Gantz has put out some of his. He's got a couple white papers and different things you can look at, and you can really, if you want to geek out on Self Us Now, that kind of thing. These are workshops we do all the time. So if you're a healthcare professional, then
they can like hire you to come do
Intent Health Strategies, like in the healthcare space. Intent Health Strategies.
That's the name of the
nonprofit.
The nonprofit.
So come in, whether it's you want to join a cohort of people or you just want to bring your team this kind of relational leadership content. Non-healthcare, Matt and I do this in non-healthcare settings, because turns out you can tell stories in all kinds of things.
As long as humans are involved. Yeah.
So, can email me and we can include that if people are interested. And, if people wanted to try this in a church setting, what a fun experiment.
Yeah.
Right. To do some workshopping and different things. So we could definitely do that.
Awesome. All right, Kyle, the last question I have for you, as you reflect on your time as a leader, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, it's funny. You listen to the podcast enough, this question is coming. Every time we lead out, big L leader, little L leader, we stand in the Savior's stead. We are there representing him. And I feel like feeling that in leadership roles makes you want to be like him, makes you want to honor that role and become more like him and lead the way that he leads. One of my favorite things to do is to look at the Savior's life and find the leadership principles that he displayed. So it's just made me want to be more like him and to follow him better than I do now.